Hello, everyone. Today's guests are Rachel Wiseman and Anastasia Berg, the authors of a new book titled What Are Children For on Ambivalence and Choice. Their new book describes one of the main explanatory factors behind the fact that fertility rates and general population increases have been plummeting over the past few years and decades. Their thesis is essentially that motherhood is often stigmatized, or at the very least undervalued, by progressives in the present day who see it as at least somewhat antithetical to feminism. So we had a lot of interesting discussion about that. We talk a little bit about how people's material standards and their ideas for how good their lives need to be in order to have children have increased. They talk a lot about, and I talk with them a lot about, how having children in the present day is coded as right-wing and some of the reasons for that. And we also talk about some of their own experiences, both their experiences talking to people on the ground about whether or not they thought that motherhood was right for them, and even some of their own personal experiences. Like, for example, there was a course that one of the guests, Rachel, took about whether motherhood was right for her, where she learned a lot of interesting things that she incorporated into the book as well. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it. Rachel Wiseman, Anastasia Berg, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thanks for
Thanks,
having
Sandy.
us.
Yeah. All right. I guess I'm gonna start with you, Rachel, because you took a course, and then you mentioned this in the book, which I thought was interesting, about whether or not motherhood was for you, and you talk about how it sort of taps into a lot of the deeper, I guess, maybe millennial concerns about motherhood, especially in progressive circles. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the course I took is called Motherhood, Is It For Me? It's led by uh, someone named Ann Davidman, who's a counselor who's been working with women and men who've expressed ambivalence about having kids. She's been doing it since the early 90s. And it's a course that is directed toward helping people tap into their inner desire about whether or not they want to have children. And it's a correspondence course, so it takes the form of some uh, calls and then sort of private exercises where you think through, you work through a workbook. And one thing that was really salient in taking the class is, one, just how alone so many people feel in trying to make this decision. And two, and this is something that's also sort of formalized in the structure of the class, the way that this decision is presented as a fundamentally private one that you have to kind of meditate on, and that there is kind of a settled answer for every individual person. And that's something that in the book, Anastasia and I kind of question a little bit, because it didn't really reflect the way that we experienced how the question is actually raised and thought through. It's very difficult for people to just silence all of these sort of external factors that are influencing one's decision, like whether your partner wants kids, or how it fits into a career, or what it means for you as a self-realized woman. And so that's something that we tried to work through in the book, starting with the subjective experiences of people who are approaching this decision and talking to them.
Yeah. So if you'll allow me to make a hackneyed pop culture reference here, it kind of have you seen have you seen Avatar: The Last Airbender? Um,
I actually have not. I only just saw the first Avatar recently.
all right, whatever. Let's move on then. Yeah,
No,
so
what's the reference? I have to know.
so one of these characters is imitating another character, and he's like imagining that character saying to him, like, you have to look within yourself to find like your true set, like your other self, and only then will your true self reveal itself. So
Mhm.
maybe the whole idea is like there is some kind of like true self buried within you that is like secretly giving you a straightforward answer about whether it is right for you to become a mother.
Right, but what we say in the book is that, it's difficult for there to be any kind of, isolated self outside of the world. This is the what our being with our families and trying to and having aspirations and thinking about the good of the world. These are all, this is the material of our lives. So it's very difficult to keep these things totally isolated and separate.
I think, and even more importantly, in order to find out what quote unquote you actually want, the idea that we could just instruct someone to ignore all the things that are weighing on them, like can they biologically have a child, and can they afford it, and are they being horrible, unethical people by doing so? We don't think that that's entirely useless, but we think it takes work. So the work of the book is, in fact, to go through the kind of concerns that people would raise, that the kind of trope of that class was to literally put in a jar and seal it away and put it away, and investigate them and ask what's underlying the presentation of these concerns as they are manifesting in people's lives. So, for instance, people sort of, in an offhand way, will say, well, I don't know if I can afford kids. And we start investigating it to find out, well, there's something really serious here. There's a serious preoccupation with very high standards of readiness, for instance. Um, there are narratives, especially for millennials, about just how poorly they're doing, but are they in fact doing so poorly? And there's also room, for instance, to compare the situation of the people who are raising these kind of concerns with the situation of people in places like the Nordic countries, where every material concern and worry about having kids has been lifted, and yet they're not having kids either. So this is just an example of wanting to take that quote unquote external and going deeper into it. So the same thing might go for a concern with, well, how am I going to find somebody to have a kid with? We don't want to, that's not the end of a story for us. That's the beginning of an investigation to the way in which people date and whether or not the things they expect from dating and the way they conduct their dating life is actually serving this purported aim they have, which is to start a family.
Yeah. And then I think that you guys, the two of you wrote a guest piece in the New York Times, which I thought was really fascinating. So I'm going to quote that right now. Quote, for young, secular, politically progressive men and women, having children has become something of an afterthought. Liberal conventional wisdom encourages people to spend their 20s on journeys of personal and professional self-discovery and self-fulfillment. So I found that really fascinating. So could you talk a little bit more about A, what our liberal culture sort of encourages people to do, and B, how that separates us from what people in their 20s did for like the majority of history?
Well, something very interesting that we discovered as we approached the concerns, as Rachel was saying, as people were raising them quite individually, is how similar the structure of the sort of conflict between a life goal like one's career or financial security or a successful relationship um, were across the board. And what we found was what we call the self-evidence of a logic of postponement. So if one thinks about their career, one is thinking, I need to secure enough finances. I'm secure enough. I know what I want to be doing before I even not have kids, but start thinking about kids. And the same things happens in a relationship. So one's 20s are supposed to be dedicated to a kind of journey of self-discovery where you're not even dating with a view to starting to have a family. And then once you do start dating even more seriously, you are meant to vet for a long time. So you date casually for a very long time. Then the milestones of the relationships are themselves postponed. You wait to move in together. You wait to meet the parents of the other partner. You have to get a pet first. And so we found that across the board, we have this logic of postponement when it seems just sort of obvious that kids should be had basically almost as as late as possible. So you often hear people saying, oh, you don't have to worry about it. You're only in your late 20s. You're only in your early 30s. You have so much time. Now, sometimes it works out. People happen to find the relationship that works out at the right time and they have kids. But a lot of time that means that people are only starting to think they should concern themselves with this question of children quite late in the game. And for women, that could mean the decision might be made for them instead of by them. In the op-ed that you mentioned, in addition to this kind of general understanding of what a successful, good, flourishing life looks like, we also point out that, especially in the American context, but there are versions of this globally, an added pressure dissuading people from thinking about children is the political one. The question of children has become so politically coded as conservative, reactionary, and religious that for liberals and progressive, it's something that has almost like an ick factor. So not only do you don't have to worry about it, but also you don't really want to worry about it. And you don't want people making you think about your fertility, and you don't want people asking whether or not you want kids because it's immediately perceived as part of this other attempt to, well, restrict women's reproductive rights and thereby choices. And what we want to introduce is the idea that you can take very seriously, say, one's opposition to these kind of conservative measures, while still recognizing that the question of children is not just one that should be determined by politics, but it's a deep human and personal question, and we should make room for the exploration of it as such.
Yeah. So I find that a little bit interesting because you mentioned a little bit that a lot of the time progressives are a bit more reluctant to have or even think about the concept of having children. There's one quote that you had in that one NYT op-ed that really stood out to me, where you said, quote, "Unreserved enthusiasm for having children can come across as essentially reactionary." Would you consider it accurate to say that a lot of part of the reason why progressives are so reluctant to think about these issues like parenting or motherhood is because they're afraid that they might give ground or even like be considered as having certain views that are coded as conservative?
Yes, certainly. Certainly, I would agree with that description.
Yeah, and it's gotten only kind of more fraught with the current reproductive landscape with the repeal of Roe v. Wade, and also just the increasing polarization of the question of family, right? So J.D. Vance, for instance, very has been very vocal about wanting to raise the birth rates. And so as a result, if you consider yourself to be a liberal progressive person, it can be alienating, or you don't want to associate with that side. But as we say in the op-ed, you shouldn't let politics make the decision for you.
No, and I would say something else, not just don't make, well, you probably shouldn't ever let politics make decisions for you. But in this case, there's an irony because in letting that very political phenomena alienate men and women from the question of whether or not they want to have children, they're letting the right determine their own reproductive agenda in yet another way. Precisely what they're trying to avoid, of course.
Yeah, there's a sort of a negative polarization where the right, they might have some reactionary views, but they might also have some reasonable views, but you don't want to give ground to the latter because you don't want to consider that, you don't want to be considered as conservative regardless of the level of reasonability of their points. Would you consider that accurate?
I think that can sometimes happen. I think certainly that could be something that's happening. But I think that in this case, I think the response is to a kind of appropriation of a topic. And we see it with other important issues of the day too. So climate change is a good comparison case, which it's not clear that conservatives and religious individuals should be opposed to measures protecting the environment. There's an easy case to be made that if conservatives are into conservation, we should be conserving our environment and be caring for it. But once that issue is coded in a certain way, we have a kind of really intolerance on both sides, I would say, to any kind of mutual challenge or equivocation or any kind of nuance in their position. It's just clear that I, as a liberal or as a progressive, stand on this issue here. And that means in every single manifestation of it, in every single variation. And so again, I think something like that is happening with the question of having children, where whatever it is the sides can learn from one another gets lost. And I would say something else. Another thing that's lost here is the possibility of cooperation across the aisle. If to the extent liberals and progressives are able to recognize that they have something in common with a concern for guaranteeing the possibility of a thriving next generation, there's real room for collaboration, for acting together, for pushing together the kind of measures that will make it easier for men and women to start families and raise children with dignity and a kind of ease.
Yeah. But I do think one thing that I found really interesting is that, like, when it comes to being able to raise children with ease, you mentioned how, like, a lot of the time Nordic countries, or like a lot of countries that have like more stronger social safety nets than the US, still have declining birth rates and declining fertility rates. So I guess my question is, do the two of you think that, like, the standards for like how good your quality of life has to be in order for it to be worthwhile to start raising a child, would you consider it accurate to say that those standards have been raised dramatically over time, and that's why, in general, first world countries tend to have lower fertility rates?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that would just say that the explanation across the board for declining fertility rates is economic. And that's something that the evidence doesn't bear out. So when we look at, first of all, to your precise question, the fact is that the more affluent a person is, the higher the socioeconomic status, the lower the birth rate. So that would suggest that it's not just a matter of people having like a slightly higher standard that most people aren't reaching. So something else is happening. The ambivalence about having children, it looks like, is not driven straightforwardly by concerns with the kind of financial impact that having children would that will have on them. But you are touching on something really important, which is the general demands, financial and otherwise, of what parenting means have risen. So people, when they imagine having to become parents, they think of having to secure for their children their own standard of living, if not a higher one. But also they imagine requirements of time, emotional investment, and then kind of a possibility of guaranteeing a kind of lifestyle that certainly is more onerous than how people imagined it before. Again, we want to separate that point from the point of, were we to supply people with more money, they would have more kids. We sort of know that's not the case.
Yeah. So then I guess, if you don't mind, I would like to ask a somewhat personal question. When it
Sure.
comes to the two of you, how have your own experiences with your own mother shaped your views on this topic?
Well, I write in the intro about how, whenever you approach a personal question as momentous as should I have children, you're always it's natural to think back on the models of family that you grew up with and that you saw. And so in my introduction, I talk about how I saw a family as a kid, and I had a very kind of stable, fairly ordinary upper middle class American existence. And my parents, it was a two-parent household. Both of them worked and were professionals. And, labored very hard to give us everything that we could ever need. At the same time, that vision of family didn't necessarily look fun or easy. I saw as my mom was trying to balance so many different demands in her life, her work as a doctor, her service work with other organizations, and her commitment as a mother. And it seemed hard. It seemed stressful. It didn't seem easy. And it did not seem like the kind of thing that I could necessarily easily sign up for. What's more, I think it was clearer for earlier generations, maybe, to figure out, okay, what things that they would want to give their children that would help them have a better childhood, a better life than the one that they grew up in. And I think for a lot of certainly Americans in a certain milieu growing up in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't as obvious, or 2000s, it wasn't as obvious what that would be. And also at the same time, there was a kind of atmosphere and message that we received, that happiness was kind of the ultimate, one's individual happiness was the ultimate goal. And so you should figure out for yourself what you want. And that did not make it very clear where family and the kind of sacrifices that raising children would require would fit in.
Yeah, so if you don't mind me asking, would you say that like your mother had this like seeing how constantly like stressful it was, even if she was pulling out all the stops to make the lives of you and your family better, did that make you a bit more apprehensive towards the idea of motherhood for you?
I mean, I think, first of all, my mom is like super mom, super grandma. Like she loves it. Like she would like nothing more than to care for people all the time. It was not so clear that that was something that was meant for me at when I was in my kind of 20s and 30s, but early 30s. But I would say more the worry that I had was that I wasn't really thinking about it at all. I didn't know how to articulate the question. I didn't know how important it was to make this decision, but I also didn't want to end up having the decision made for me and just kind of passively move on in my life without having a real say in the shape of my life. Yeah, so I would say that where for my mom, it was very obvious. Like it was never really a question, would I want to be a mother? For me, it was a question.
Yeah.
I think something really interesting though, Andrew, is that you asked about relationship with mothers. And of course, one of the interventions we hope the book will perform is to mark the fact that we have gotten too used to thinking of the question of children as a question that's for women and that is about women. And it's interesting you didn't ask us about a relation to fathers. And I think that's indicative. I think when we think about kids and we think about people making the decision, we think of women thinking about their moms and thinking about becoming moms. But of course, in at least heterosexual relationship, that involves men, and we have gay men as well as gay women, of course, also contemplating and choosing to have children. And we think that this framing, this go-to framing that we're all kind of a part of, is one of the reasons I think it is actually hard for women to think about having kids and making the prospect more threatening and more anxiety producing because it's something that's just theirs. And it has a real interpersonal dimension where today, for liberals and progressives, a little bit because of the stuff we already started talking about, men have a feeling that this really is not a question for them. So when we interviewed men about talking to partners about kids, they said, well, I would never raise it, or I would feel controlling and creepy and weird. But what happens as a result is that women feel very isolated with the decision and hence the responsibility of making it and then of care. So it's very interesting. And I just want to kind of punctuate that, we should be asking Rachel also about her relationship with her dad. And we want to really invite men to feel like this is a conversation they're welcome in, and that, they should feel some responsibility also figuring out what they want and being able to communicate really openly about it.
Yeah. I think that provides a pretty neat seg to my next question, which is like, when it comes to in the present day, why do you think what do you think are some of the cultural reasons for why there's a bit more of a social stigma against men bringing up the idea of having children, or like having strong feelings about having children to their partners, and what can we do to try to counteract that?
Well, um, there's an understanding, again, in liberal and progressive circles, and a healthy and a welcome one, that we should give women the conditions to make decisions about the course of their lives, and that we should be securing their bodily autonomy. And this can create a pressure, we could call it a pressure of interpretation. What does this mean? So one of the things it's been taken to mean is precisely what you just described, is a kind of taboo on male participation, where the fear is that in expressing a desire, not even too strongly, but just expressing it at all, we're already putting undue pressure on the person in front of us. And to the question of, well, how do we remedy this situation? Well, part of the work is first just acknowledging this dynamic and its effects. And once we do, we realize that, yeah, it's hard to hear from anyone in a relationship, if it's friendship or a romantic one, that they want something that either we don't want, or that we're not sure whether or not we want, or we're not sure we can give them. But that cannot be a reason for us to not create that space for open conversation in relationships about the question of children. Because again, we spoke to a lot of men and women. We talked to women who would say they would take years before they would really raise a question of children in a relationship, only to find out sometimes that perhaps the person is not interested in having children. And, again, having the decision being made for them by time. That seems to us, if we're looking at it from a feminist perspective, which is a perspective wants to empower women, that seems like we're not empowering those women. We're putting those women in a position where they weren't able to give full determinate shape to their lives according to what they want from it. And the challenge is, in some ways, sort of get over the awkwardness, communicate the fact that I'm just trying to figure out what it is that I want so that we can figure this out together. There are models for this. We do this all the time with other topics. The real challenge is to kind of realize, oh, it's one of these topics. It's hard to talk about. It can be awkward. We have to be really delicate, but it's not impossible.
And relatedly, there's a temptation nowadays to want to separate one's romantic search from the kind of family aspirations and family ambitions, right? So people end up dating for a very long time under this paradigm that a researcher has called slow love, without really addressing the question of whether or not they want to have children, whether individually or together. And there's this assumption that often many people have, that it's only when the relationship has reached a certain level that you can even begin broaching the question, do I want to have kids? And that can create, some difficult situations and we interviewed several people to this effect, where they can date for 5, 6, 7 years without even having a conversation about whether or not family is something that they picture for their future.
Would you be down to like pivot into talking about pop culture?
Sure, always.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess, yeah, then that provides me a good excuse to just ask an extremely straightforward question. What are some depictions of motherhood that you two have seen in pop culture?
I think what's interesting is that today, in trying to examine the past few decades of representations of women, especially when they're protagonists, which now is often, is actually how rarely is motherhood and its depiction a part of that story. So if before women were depicted as kind of second fiddles in a domestic situation. Now that they're taking center stage, they are remarkably frequently childless. And that could be whether or not they're political operators. So think about House of Cards or Scandal. They could be kind of hipster stoners like Broad City. They could be high-powered lawyers. They could be spies. They could be all of our not action figures, what are they called? Superheroes, but they're not mothers. And when they are mothers, they're very reluctant ones and closely linked to that, not very good. But for the most part, they're not moms at all. And in fact, we really tried hard to say, is there any kind of depiction of a woman where she sort of deserves to be a main character? Like it's her story that matters. It's her that we're going to get invested in, when we can see anything like functional motherhood. And we couldn't. So that was one thing that's happening that I think is really interesting. We're not exposed to those kind of models as part of our contemporary landscape. But another thing that's really interesting that we noticed is that there's also a kind of subtle proliferation of a kind of fantasy. And this is the fantasy of the accidental pregnancy. So if you think about the show Friends, now a little old, but a very significant timeline towards the end of the show, a plot line towards the end of the show, is that of Rachel, played by Jennifer Aniston, getting accidentally pregnant. If you look at the show Girls, in a way, an update of Friends, that people always think of Sex and the City, but it really is also an update of Friends as a show about young people in New York trying to figure out their lives. Again, the show ends with an accidental pregnancy. And even the very popular YA book series and then film series, Twilight, the characters get married. And yet, when they get pregnant, it's a complete surprise. It's a shock. I can't believe I'm pregnant. Why can't you believe you're pregnant? This is what is the problem of believing it? But they don't. And what we think is that fantasy, what it expresses is not so much necessarily like a literal fantasy of getting knocked up, although perhaps that occurs as well. But it's a fantasy of being able to have children in a way by short-circuiting that whole process of very fraught deliberation and that really hard to navigate process of finding the right partner, determining that you personally and then you together are really at a place in your lives where you can really be ready to have kids. All these things that seem incredibly difficult. And that idea of the accidental pregnancy, it offers the possibility of just, circumventing all that. And here you are with a child.
Yeah, maybe it gives you an excuse to feel like you don't have any agency, because maybe that relieves some of the societal burden that you feel like you would otherwise have.
I think part of it is certainly that I get to have what I want, but I didn't have to exercise agency in a way that would require me, for instance, to justify my choice. And so one of the underlying, say, propositions of the book is to bring to our attention that what's the biggest change in our attitudes toward children is not that, we've become just sort of a little more reluctant to spend money on them, or they've become sort of straightforwardly less important, but that, or sort of offering less advantages than they used to, coming with more disadvantages, but really is that we've come to evaluate them in a way that requires justification at all. If children in the past were something that belonged to the very framework of a human life, it was part of what it meant to be a human being, was that you had a past and you have a future and you have a role to play in bringing about that future. And oftentimes that role means directly bringing about children. That is no longer the case. Children become one more possible choice, one more possible project among others. And it's from that standpoint that now I need to explain and justify to myself, to others, why it is that I'm doing this. And that is a huge burden. And precisely like you're saying, that fantasy is one where, I get to have this thing that I want, but I don't have to take on the full responsibility for this choice.
Yeah, so like, were you able to find at least a few examples of like motherhood being an example of something that the central character like has agency in? Either they chose it or like they're a main character and like it's promoted in a positive way.
No. No, we looked. We really tried. I mean, if you have an example, we'll take it. What are you thinking of?
What about Helen Parr from The Incredibles, like the Pixar animated movie? Does that count?
I mean,
I don't
what's interesting
know.
about The Incredibles is that it's like a throwback Pixar movie. Like it's like all of the aesthetics are very like 1950s, and the whole thing is quite like it doesn't exactly feel like it's the world that we're living in, not just because it's a cartoon, but also because the vision of nuclear family that's presented there is not the one that we are taking as our own today.
And in a way, its effectiveness is precisely because it's retro. And it's not just retro in its aesthetics, but it's just retro in its social situation. It's retro in the fact that there's like a happy little family, but which is functional. So yeah, that's a very good point, Rachel.
Yeah, but okay,
You're right.
At least it's like
So
better than average. Would you agree with that?
again, I think what we'd want to see is show us a depiction. It doesn't have to be, it could be a cartoon one, it could be fanciful, but that suggests that this is a model for people to live together. I don't think people looking at The Incredibles are thinking that's a family that a person can straightforwardly want today, even abstracting from the superpowers question.
I
Yeah,
also think that if you look at the way that she's depicted, I'm trying to remember what her superpower was. It's like she's elastic, right? Something like this.
something like that, yeah.
But like, yeah, so she's always like stretching herself to like try to catch the baby that's, or like the baby that's like blowing up, or the child that's like running too fast, or the like surly teenager. There is a sense that's even in this positive depiction, in a, Pixar film, she seems like she's really stretched thin, literally.
Yeah, and like this job is still incredibly stressful for her, regardless of whether like she counts as a positive role model.
Yeah, I mean, there's another genre of motherhood film that we don't talk about that much in the book, but where it's mommy horror, right? Where motherhood is presented as like a very threatening uh event, both for the woman and for the children, right? And this is a genre that, goes back to Rosemary's Baby. It's not just a contemporary phenomenon, but there has been a real kind of uptick in the number of these films, like Darren Aronofsky's Mother. There's Good Night Mommy. I think there have been a couple about IVF recently, where motherhood is presented as something that is a not just a body horror, but like a real psychic horror as
Okay,
well.
I guess I have one more example. I think this is a show that you probably haven't seen. There is one specific character in the later seasons of The Legend of Korra that might fit the bill of what you're talking about. So if you ever watch that,
I have
when you
not
get
seen that show.
if you
What
get
is
to like
it?
there's a character in like seasons 3 and 4. I don't know if I'll just say like if you watch that show, you should keep a lookout for
Okay.
positive.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess my last question is what would you say are like if you were to try to distill all we've talked about into like when it comes to like what society is saying, what would you say are like the two like competing dominant narrative frameworks that you've encountered about motherhood? And to what extent do you think we should be critical of them? And to what extent do you think we should at least acknowledge their limitations?
Well, one thing that we talk about in the book is that, depending on who you talk to, and both standpoints are not wrong, society can seem at once, militantly pro-natalist on the one hand, and also anti-natalist on the other hand, that there are competing pressures that make it difficult to on the one hand, embrace the choice to have a family, and on the other, to feel validated in the decision to not have a family. And so these are things that we, investigate at length, and how it is, depending on where you stand, you can feel immense pressure, no matter what your decision actually is.
I think another really prevalent narrative that we haven't touched upon is the idea that in becoming a parent, and this is especially true when people think about motherhood, but in general, in becoming a parent, this is something that involves a real sort of radical transformation, not just of the circumstances of your life, but really of your identity. And this, on the one hand, like many of the things we've been talking about today, is coming from a good place. A lot of it is trying to make the experience of motherhood, quote unquote, visible. So we want to be able to talk about it. We want to acknowledge the fact that it really is very challenging, that it's a big upheaval in a person's life, but it can also come at a cost. And the cost is that once you're told that in doing this thing, you might become someone completely new at the expense of possibly your other identities, they could make the decision that much harder to make. And then if you do undergo this experience, you don't necessarily see yourself in this narrative, you don't feel yourself radically transformed, you might wonder, am I doing this wrong? And so one of the things that we want to also liberate people from is at least the necessity of this narrative, and remind us of the way in which children can be continuous with a human life, which I think was a thought that was more familiar and more prevalent in the past. So people didn't think that life as they know it ends when they have kids, partly because they're also having kids a little younger. They could really see a life after having children, right? If your kids are out of the house by your mid 40s, I mean, today, mid 40s is, people think of it as a time when they start their lives. And so imagining children under circumstances where you can think that they will not cost you everything that you care about, everything you believe in, everything that you love doing. And I think that's really important to remind people of as well.
Rachel Wiseman, Anastasia Berg, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for having us.